Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today for our event, Old Bullies, New Toys, Confronting Iran and North Korea, where we will focus on the threats posed by nuclear weapons in the hands of these two rogue states and how missile defense can play a role. We are honored to be partnered with the Ronald Reagan Institute to host this important event. In a moment, I'll turn it over to Roger Zakheim for his remarks. This is a two-part event. First, Roger Zakheim will discuss these issues with Representative Mike Turner, and then that will be followed by an expert panel discussion. Well, while North Korea and Iran pose significant regional threats to U.S. interests, it is their acquisition or potential acquisition of nuclear weapons which elevates the risk to a strategic level. To discuss these threats and solutions, we have a great group of leaders and experts to share their thoughts, and this promises to be an exciting session. I encourage you to submit as many questions as you want in the question block, and we will get to them in the time that we have available. And now I will hand the floor over to Roger Zakheim, the director of the Ronald Reagan Institute. Roger, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks so much. It's great to be with you and our friends at the Heritage Foundation, and to be with our guests who I'll introduce now. First elected to Congress in 2002, proudly representing Ohio's 10th district, which includes the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Congressman Turner has been on the Armed Services Committee, where he serves currently as a ranking member on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, and also in the past has served as chairman of that subcommittee, which includes jurisdiction over the nation's nuclear arsenal, the Department of Defense intelligence programs, and the missile defense system. So he certainly has the experience and the jurisdiction from the subcommittee to cover all the topics included in our conversation today. Prior to coming to Congress, he served as mayor of Dayton for 8 years, and I had an opportunity for, I think, all 8 years that I was on the Armed Services Committee professional staff to support Congressman Turner. And my memory is that if you were going to support Congressman Turner, you better know your file, because he was on top of the issues. No doubt all of us will see that today. So Congressman Turner, welcome. I think we'll just jump right into it. Well, I'm hopeful the congressman can hear me. And I thought we'd start with the defense budget. I know he's sitting in Capitol Hill at the moment, where the president's skinny budget arrived just last week. And many of those watching today are thinking about the national defense budget that the Biden administration will send over, and its impact on our national defense and the priorities that we will be discussing today when we think about Iran and North Korea and our nuclear weapons arsenal, as well as missile defense. So I think I see Congressman Turner. There we go. Congressman, I don't know if you caught it, but I gave you an elaborate introduction fitting of a former chair and current ranking member of the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces.
Well, Roger, I just want to thank you for your leadership. You were a great leader on the Armed Services Committee as you staffed and mentored, I think, all the members there, and of course your continued leadership at the Ronald Reagan Institute. We appreciate your contributions to the discussion of national security, and really your focus in trying to make sure that people have the information that they need about the challenges to our nation.
Well, thanks for that. And love engaging with you. And I was sharing with the audience how you're one of those members of Congress that know your file and know the details and take the portfolio so seriously. I want to, we'll jump to nuclear deterrence and missile defense, but taking a step back, you've always been a leader on the defense budget and top line. You were one of the first to kind of forewarn the Biden administration that they have to bring in a strong national defense budget. You stated that President Biden should put American national security interests first by following the advice of military experts as he prepares the details of his budget proposal. You've seen there's a $15 billion request, just counting the 051. How do you feel about that budget? And specifically, is it adequately in your mind going to fund our missile defense programs and nuclear modernization?
Well, we'll have to see the final numbers as to what they do with respect to nuclear modernization and missile defense, but certainly the top line numbers are worrisome. All of our military leadership has indicated we need a steady 3 to 5% growth in military spending in order to be able to accomplish what we need to in national security. As you're well aware, not only have we had to go back and try to backfill, if you will, so that we can achieve the readiness that's necessary that we were losing during the Obama administration and sequester, but we've had to take up the modernization programs that were put on hold during that period, but then also, to go into the next generation of modernization as a result of what we see our near peer adversaries doing. If you look at what China and Russia is doing, and the certainly what if you look at the equipment that's being amassed on the border of Ukraine, you can tell that the United States has much work to do in going to that next level of modernization, and that's going to require sufficient funds on the top line so that we can invest not just in our military today, but in the future.
I want to dive into the nuclear modernization piece, a slice of what you just referenced in terms of national defense priorities. You joined with Ranking Member Rogers in a letter to President Biden saying now is the time to prioritize long overdue investments required for the DoD, including the National Nuclear Security Administration, which of course resides in the Department of Energy, saying that we have regrettably allowed much of our nuclear deterrent to atrophy. There is movement within the Congress. The chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith, I think has skepticism about all three legs of the triad, perhaps favoring investment in a dyad, just the undersea submarine boomer launched nuclear weapon, as well as the tactical and the bomber. So what is your view in terms of the nuclear deterrent and the need for all three legs of the triad?
Right. So, well, first let's just deal with the triad itself. And I think the most important aspect of the triad is that anyone who proposes going to a dyad has the assumption that our submarines will be stealth forever. And you and I could wake up one day and on that day find that suddenly our subs are completely discoverable, and the vulnerability in the system that we would have would be unacceptable and certainly would not deter our adversaries. It's incredibly important that we have all three legs of the triad to be able to have that credible deterrence. Remember, deterrence is about keeping peace. It's about keeping, avoiding nuclear war, avoiding conflict with major nations. And so that's why it's that important that it be reliable and certainly perceived by our adversaries as being a credible threat. The other aspect that we have here is that there really is a significant remnant in Congress from the Obama rhetoric of going to nuclear zero that still sees our nuclear forces as a provocative force and as opposed to a peacekeeping force. And as a result of that, the movement for unilateral disarmament continues. We had motions in our last National Defense Authorization Act debates where they would have dismantled our modernization. We are in a critical path right now of needing to modernize the nuclear weapons that we have deployed, or we will cease to be able, including our ally, the UK, who's dependent upon the United States, will cease to be able to continue to have that credible deterrence deployed.
So let's talk about the deterrence, and obviously that's the role of the triad. And I take your point that we can't just rely on the dyad to achieve that level of deterrence. Iran and North Korea, the focus of our event today, in your mind, I think are deterred by our nuclear capability. Senator Warren, when she was running for president, advocated for a no first use policy. And then the Biden administration recently put out their interim national security guidance, which said that, we will take steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy. So both from a no first use policy advocated from Senator Warren, as well as the interim national security guidance, which the Biden administration recently put forward, I'm curious to get your view how that is being interpreted by North Korea and in Iran, and whether or not you believe that this would cut against that deterrent and increase the risk of Iran and North Korea threatening our forward deployed forces and our friends and allies. So, Congressman, I was just referencing two things that have happened during the presidential campaign and recently. Senator Warren calling for a no first use policy, and the interim national security guidance calling for a reduction in the role of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy. And I wanted to get your view on whether Iran and North Korea, and how they react for it, and how it impacts the deterrence that you just were sharing with us is kind of vital to national defense.
Right. Well, let me apologize. Obviously, here on Capitol Hill, we're having difficulty with our internet connection. So thank you for tolerating that and letting me sign back on.
I'm playing the role of senator here. I'm really filibustering. I'm putting the audience to sleep, so hopefully you can wake them up.
So there is no one who's an adversary to the United States who's going to be deterred from any action that we take to limit our nuclear policy and our nuclear forces that are deployed as a backstop for the United States. Whether or not we've reduced our numbers, whether or not we have removed nuclear weapons from areas, or whatever policies were in place, they have had no effect to cause others to similarly disarm or to not seek nuclear weapons. It is folly to think that some stated policy of no first use is going to cause anyone who's an adversary to the United States to do something that's going to make us more safe. And that's what this is all about, right? How are we more safe? And so it's a meaningless debate that I hope never takes hold here and never wins the majority. Even if we did intend it, I don't think our allies would feel comforted, and I think our adversaries would not feel deterred. So in both areas where we need nuclear forces to have an impact, we would be diminishing our effect.
I want to jump to North Korea. One of the things I recall having opportunity to work with you when I was on the staff, and you were leading the Strategic Forces Committee, was that within your district, within Wright-Patt, you have NASIC, and you always had a really good insight into how our military understood the threats posed by our adversaries. And you always seem to be the one who had the most polished and most sophisticated understanding, really from a military standpoint, what our adversaries were trying to do. Give me your take just on North Korea and their nuclear weapons program and ballistic missile program. They had a test recently, just last month, and confirm what a lot of analysts, some of those who would be on the next panel, thought that North Korea would test Biden early in his administration. Just give me a sense of what they're seeking to achieve, and then we'll talk about a U.S. response.
Right. So if you look at what North Korea has currently sought to both develop and then deploy, they're looking for their ICBM capability that would hold the United States at risk. They're now looking to put nuclear weapons on submarines that would further allow them to put both the United States and our allies at risk. The Trump administration, when they first began to deal with the North Korea threat, they understood that there would be no nuclear North Korea without China and China's approval and consent. So they put pressure on China. They identified it directly that China needs to intervene. They put pressure on North Korea, understanding that North Korea feeling that they could be imminently threatened, that you could perhaps bring them to the table, and in looking at ways to try to restrict, both through sanctions and technology restrictions, their ability to advance. I hope the Biden administration does see North Korea as a continuing threat as they continue to advance both the capabilities, their number of nuclear weapons. Their intention of holding the United States at risk is, of course, an intention to be able to, in effect, deter us and or place the United States at risk for other interests that they might have, including putting South Korea at risk.
So let's go to the flip side of it. All right, that gets on the intent side. The recent Reagan National Defense Survey, you may recall, we do this annually and we release it at the Reagan National Defense Forum. The survey found that if the United States suspected North Korea was going to launch an attack against the U.S., 78% of Americans support working with allies to prevent that attack from happening, and even using force if necessary. Because we're going to focus on missile defense and other things, how capable are we of defending ourselves against an ICBM attack from North Korea? I mean, to what extent do we have the capabilities in place today to respond to an intercontinental ballistic missile attack should it happen from North Korea? It looks like you're having some technical problems there, but we'll just pause as we get those resolved and pick up the discussion regarding North Korea and our ability to respond to an ICBM attack. Can hear you?
Yeah. So I just so we've gone low tech now. This is now off of an iPhone, so sorry about that. Apparently not reliable up here on Capitol Hill today.
Well, I appreciate the resilience and the entrepreneurship of you and your team to figure out a way to make this work.
Great job here. So I'm sorry, where were we?
Well, I'll bring you back. It's exciting stuff. When I last left you, we were talking about North Korea. You were talking about their intent and capabilities they're developing. And I shared a data point from our National Defense Survey, all of which was to ask you, what is our capability today in terms of being able to defend ourselves or forward deployed forces or just the homeland against an ICBM attack from the Hermit Kingdom?
Yeah, well, as you know, our ground-based missile defense system was put in place as a result of the North Korea threat. That remains today a workable system that can give us some coverage and protection. Certainly our Aegis Ashore system that we placed in Europe has been in response to the Iranian evolving threat. And then, of course, the Aegis that we have on ships is deployable and maneuverable and can also have some effect to hopefully affect upon launch. The real key here is that we need to do more. When missile defense was first proposed, people believed it was going to be provocative and that it was going to cost too much and not work. Well, Israel really has shown us that it's not provocative, it's actually de-escalatory. It gives people space as you defend yourself from oncoming missile attack. Two, it does work. And three, it is certainly the cost is much lower than absorbing an attack from a conflict. In nuclear weapons, we don't really have any margin of error. So it's even that much more critical and that much more important that we have capabilities to be able to defend the United States. Now, again, there has been this stasis in the US Congress in fully committing to the deployment and to the funding of missile defense technology, advancing missile defense technology. There are a number of things that we need to take the next step to, including looking at what space-based assets that we may need, additional directed energy are just on the floor, able to be developed. So we have assets today, but the threat is evolving. And at the same time, we do have the ability with the appropriate investment to significantly advance the defense of the United States.
I wanted to ask you just a follow-up on some of the technologies you were just referencing and to look at them through the lens of how do we use missile defense to be a cost imposing kind of capability. And by that, I mean, I think of missile defense as it really buys you time. In addition to the deterrence, which you just articulated, but in the event an adversary is shooting something at you, you can go ahead and immediately defend yourself, protect your forward deployed forces, your allies, friends, or the homeland. And then while you've achieved that protection from missile defense, then your offensive assets can go ahead and take out the source of the attacks. Is the rudimentary basic concept of missile defense. The question is there a way to make it more cost imposing? Because you can't, right now, it doesn't make sense for us to just continue firing off those, the missiles for defense purposes because they just cost so much. Though you mentioned the Israelis have figured out ways, at least for protecting their citizens in and around Gaza, where they've brought down the cost. So talk to me a little bit about missile defense and your hopes and aspirations for being more of a cost imposing strategy.
Well, I think, one of the things that you just pointed out is really important. People need to take that next step, and that is, if an adversary gets to the step of where they're going to be targeting the United States and then launching, at that point, not only do you defend, but you also have the ability to take out the remaining assets that are a threat to the United States. That is incredibly important, because at that point, their intent is well known, and attack has ensued, and you have the ability then to defend the United States by actually attacking the person who would subvert our ability for missile defense to work. But in all of this, the effort is to give you that space so that you're not in a position where you have to attack. And we've seen North Korea march weapons to the launch pad and declare their intention to attack both the United States and our allies. And without missile defense, we would absolutely have to preemptively take out those assets. With missile defense, we have the ability to wait. And in this instance that I'm speaking of, they actually then move the missile back. That gives us the space to not cause an escalation of the conflict.
That's a great point in terms of kind of how missile defense advances peace, sustains the peace. I mean, kind of going to some of the remarks you made earlier in our conversation. We have just a few minutes left, Congressman, and I want to jump to Iran. But before we do that, I did want to get your take on Guam and a threat posed to Guam by China. This recently was kind of in the news, and lawmakers were pressing the presumptive next commander of Indo-PACOM, as the need for missile defense to protect our forward deployed forces in Guam. Can you just add some color on that and give us what your view is on that?
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me now, but I think you were asking me about Guam and missile defense.
You got it.
Yes, okay. I think in all areas, certainly in the issue of missile defense capabilities, we need to increase those capabilities and deploy them. We certainly saw in Iraq, as we were looking at Iran attacking our forces, that the concern of the lack of deployment of missile defense assets. Certainly Guam is an area that we know we have an adversary that is targeting the area. And we need to bolster those defenses. I think really in all areas, if we increase our capabilities, increase the number of assets that we have, and increase their deployment, we will deter the adversary, not just keep our forces safe. Because if our adversaries know that they're not necessarily going to be successful, they may pause.
All right, we're going to jump 2 questions on Iran, and then we'll wrap it up. And so grateful to you, Congressman Turner, for doing this event with us, particularly with Capitol Hill throwing you some curveballs in the Wi-Fi today. So stick with us just a little bit longer. On February 23rd of this year, General John Hyten, who's the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that our national defense capability is really focused on North Korea, not on Russia, not on China, and not on Iran. With Iran developing, constructing underground ballistic missile sites just 500 miles away from Kuwait, where we have forward deployed forces, some 13,000 or so there, are you concerned? Do you think we need to be focusing more on missile defense to respond to the Iranian threat and the exposure of our forward deployed forces and, of course, our friends and allies?
Yes, absolutely. In addition to giving greater protection for the United States mainland, I authored the legislation to create a missile defense site, which would give us the ability to look, shoot, look. And of course, now we're looking as to ways in which we can send ground-based missile defense systems with Aegis support here, as we also look to bolstering those that we already have on the European continent. We can't wait until the adversary is placing us at risk. We already know that they're developing missile technology, and of course now Iran has announced they're up to 60% enrichment, 90% being grade level for a weapon. We need to make certain we move quickly.
Last question before we have to wrap up, but it goes to where you just left off with Iran now looking to go full speed ahead on their nuclear weapons program. And President Biden's Iran envoy, Rob Malley, recently said in an interview that the maximum pressure campaign has failed, referencing the Trump administration campaign to place maximum pressure on Iran. It was a failure, a predictable failure. It hasn't made life any better for the Iranian people. It hasn't made life any better for the U.S. and the region. And I'm still quoting here, hasn't brought us any closer to this better deal that President Trump spoke about. Give me your view. Are we better off because of maximum pressure? What's your take on Rob Malley's quote, which I just shared?
Well, of course, it's absolutely wrong, but it won't advance us if the Biden administration immediately concedes, and that's what they've done in trying to re-enter the flawed Obama JCPOA. The agreement had critical provisions that were limited in time. It did not include missile technology that could reach the United States. It had a limited inspection regime, and it didn't include their malign activities in the area. This administration's rush back into that deal makes us less safe. If Iran wants concessions in sanctions and to re-engage both with the United States and with the other signatories of JCPOA, they need to do so by coming back to the table and renegotiating the deal. Conceding, though, will not get you concessions, and that's of course how the Obama administration almost began by saying, well, we got the deal we could get. We need the deal that will make us safe. And Iran needs to be placed in a position where that deal is of great interest to them also.
We'll leave it there, conceding without making concessions. Congressman Turner, we thank you for your time today, your expertise, and appreciate your leadership in the U.S. Congress on these issues. Now we'll go to the Heritage Foundation Nuclear Deterrence and Missile Defense Policy Analyst Patty Jane Geller to lead the second portion of our event today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Roger, and thanks so much to Congressman Turner for that awesome discussion. So now we're going to turn to our panel of experts who will get to dive a bit more deeply into these issues. I'm Patty Jane Geller, as Roger mentioned, and I'm a policy analyst here at the Heritage Foundation. And joining me today to discuss North Korea, Iran, and potential responses are three experts on these topics. So now I'd like to invite our panelists to join us on screen so I can introduce them to you. First, we have Bruce Klingner, a Heritage Foundation Senior Fellow and one of the country's top experts on North Korea, having covered it extensively during his time at the CIA. Bruce will be getting us smart on the challenges that emanate from the Korean Peninsula. Next, we have Peter Brooks, a Heritage Foundation Senior Fellow, who will be stepping in for David Albright of the Institute for Science and International Security. David was delayed in returning from Europe, so we're grateful that Pete can step in, and that's also why you have me filling in as a moderator today. Then we'll hear from Tom Carrico, a Senior Fellow at the International Security Program and Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Tom will give us some thoughts on countering threats that come from North Korean and Iranian missiles and nuclear weapons. So we're going to start with opening remarks from each of our panelists of about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll move to a moderated discussion where I will field questions from the audience that you can continue to submit throughout the event. So with that, Bruce, whenever you're ready, please start us off.
All right, well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be back at Heritage, if only virtually, with my colleagues and my good friend Tom Carrico. In looking at North Korea, one thing I've discovered over the years or decades that I've been looking at it is that oftentimes experts will underestimate or even downplay North Korea's nuclear, missile, and cyber capabilities. Without getting into the nomenclature of the missiles or missile ranges, but sort of more at a strategic level, I think it's important to focus on what North Korea has accomplished in just the last few years. They've accelerated the development, the production, and the testing of nuclear weapons and missiles, including testing a hydrogen bomb. They created a new generation of more advanced, more accurate, and more survivable missiles for all rangers. And that escalates the nuclear threat against South Korea, Japan, US bases in Okinawa and Guam, and the continental United States. North Korea has also developed mobile land-based and sea-based missile systems that are harder to detect and target. They've produced several different solid fuel missiles that reduce the time necessary for launch, and that constrains the warning time for the US and its allies and able to respond. They've developed short-range missiles with a greater capability to evade Allied missile defenses in South Korea. And they have submarine launched ballistic missiles, and they're developing new ones that would threaten South Korea's exposed flanks, because right now South Korea doesn't have missiles on their Aegis class cruisers that can defend against ballistic missiles. The existing SM-2 missiles can only defend against anti-ship missiles. And they have ICBMs that can target all of the continental United States. And they are now working towards multiple reentry vehicle capability. And that's very worrisome because, as we heard the congressman say, we have only a limited number of ground-based interceptors, which are deployed in California and Alaska. And so if North Korea has multiple warheads, as Kim Jong-un said he is working towards, on ICBMs, that, along with another development we saw recently at a recent parade, where they now can indigenously produce these very large transporter erector launchers for their ICBMs. And before, they were limited to 6 very large Chinese logging trucks that they had purchased and converted to carry ICBMs. So now if they can send more ICBMs out into the field because of their own indigenously produced launchers and have multiple warheads, that could risk overwhelming the US ground-based interceptor ability to defend the continental US, because the US has said it may fire multiple, perhaps 4 each, at each incoming North Korean missile or warhead. The North Koreans have also practiced missile launches under wartime conditions. They've fired multiple missiles from numerous locations throughout the country, and they've simulated and announced that they were simulating nuclear airbursts over South Korea and Japan, and they've conducted salvo launches of several missiles simultaneously. Now, all of these new missiles that have been deployed, as well as even more missiles that we've seen in their October and January parades that will continue to be developed, they risk overwhelming they have overcome the shortcomings of their predecessors and now pose a far greater threat to allied forces, including our missile defense systems. So Pyongyang's evolving nuclear and missile forces increasingly provide the regime with the ability to conduct a surprise preemptive first attack, a retaliatory second strike, and battlefield counterforce attacks. And Pyongyang's continuing development of nuclear missile programs beyond what would be required for a deterrence suggests the regime is striving for a warfighting capability and also its warfighting strategy. And this all puts allied forces at risk. It augments the danger to the continental US, and it degrades the military responses to North Korean actions. So it also undermines the effectiveness of existing war plans, such as Op Plan 5015, which is the allied response to a all-out North Korean attack. And through its cyber capabilities, North Korea has gained access to that war plan. It also raises the potential for greater regime willingness to engage in even more provocative behavior, as well as coercive diplomacy towards South Korea and Japan. And the ability to hit the continental US with nuclear weapons, including hydrogen bombs, could inhibit US responses or exacerbate existing allied concerns about the viability of the US extended deterrence guarantee. What we've been increasingly hearing from our South Korean and Japanese colleagues is, would you really put your own cities at risk on behalf of theirs? Would you sacrifice San Francisco for Seoul, or would you sacrifice Toledo for Tokyo? So South Korea and Japan have already been questioning our commitment, and such misgivings could lead Seoul to be more accommodating to Pyongyang, or either nation to go down the nuclear path themselves. Now, just quickly, what are the prospects for talks? Well, right now, the Biden administration is completing its policy review on North Korea. We don't know the parameters of it, but we have a few knowns. We know that they will go back to a bottom-up approach where you don't have a summit meeting for show, that you actually have to have progress at the working level towards a denuclearization agreement before you have a summit, and also that there will be a more positive view of US allies and our approach to our alliances. Things that we don't know are what would be the acceptable parameters of a denuclearization accord for the Biden administration, and also how firmly will they enforce UN resolution sanctions as well as US laws. What we've seen under successive US administrations, Republican and Democrat, is not even fully enforcing our own laws against Chinese and North Korean and other entities which are committing money laundering crimes on US soil and US banks, and other violations of US law. So we have an expectation that North Korea will do something very provocative in the next few months, because historically they've always done something big early on in a US and a South Korean administration, a nuclear test or an ICBM test. They did it for President Trump, President Obama, President Bush, as well as South Korean presidents. So things may get higher tensions on the Korean Peninsula within the next few months. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Bruce. Now I'll turn it over to Pete to discuss Iran. Are you on mute, Pete? I can't hear you.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Sorry, thought I'd clicked it. Anyway, good afternoon. Thank you, Patty Jane, for sitting in for me as moderator. And I apologize to the audience that David Albright of the Good ISIS, as they note. In fact, I think that's his Twitter handle, at the Good ISIS, isn't with us today to talk about Iran. But I'll do my best to fill in for him. And there's plenty to say about Iran, as you all know. And in my estimation, Iran is really an increasing threat to international security from its steadfast support of international terrorism to its desire to dominate the Middle East. But in the limited time I have today, let me quickly focus on its nuclear and missile programs. On this issue, I think there's reasons to be deeply concerned. Just as Bruce was talking about North Korea. News out today, I mean, there's never a boring day when you're dealing with Iran. They talk about they're going to triple uranium production, and they're also going to increase uranium enrichment from 20% up to 60%. And as you all know, that you're on the way to 90%, which is considered to be weapons grade. Of course, talks are going on in Vienna with the United States playing an indirect role. They're certainly present, but they're not present at the table with the Iranians, which could mean a return under the Biden administration to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA or nuclear deal, whatever you prefer. And I think a return to that plan, the JCPOA, would be a mistake. So I'll be upfront about that. I mean, doing so, in my estimation, would reward a hostile dictatorship that has repeatedly reneged on its non-proliferation commitments and pocketed past concessions without moderating its aggressive behavior, international behavior. But why am I concerned about the JCPOA? I think it's worth reviewing it since there's been so many of them since going back to 2018, 2019. One of the big problems is that key provisions of the JCPOA sunset. That is, they expire. The JCPOA did not end Tehran's nuclear program and only slowed it down. As I like to say, we added speed bumps, but no stop signs. Iran has not sworn off, its nuclear program in perpetuity. For instance, major uranium enrichment restrictions that are central to producing the fissile material for a nuclear weapon begin to expire at the 10-year mark. Well, I also have to remind people that that was going back to 2015. We're already 6 years into that 10 years. So we're talking about 2025, and Iran will be able to move forward quite significantly with its uranium enrichment and other nuclear activities. The deal doesn't also allow military site inspection. I mean, I think Bruce will, as a former somebody involved in arms control, will appreciate this. I mean, shockingly, the JCPOA doesn't allow anytime, anywhere inspections, which I think is a key verification tool, especially when you're dealing with a country such as Iran. Iran has made its military bases off limits. Of course, the IRGC is involved in the nuclear and missile programs. And of course, a military base is a logical place for Iran to build a nuclear weapon. I mean, this doesn't inspire confidence, considering Iran's record on deceit on non-proliferation matters. I mean, think about it, their signature of the non-proliferation treaty and the fact that they were cheating on that for many, many, many years, decades actually. There are still questions out there about the possible military dimensions, also known as the PMDs, that remain unresolved through the IAEA. Iran was supposed to be completely transparent with the IAEA about its earlier nuclear weapons work, things that precede 2003, where the intelligence community has tossed around the idea that maybe Iran stopped its nuclear weapons development program, not its nuclear activities, but its development program on a bomb. That you need this sort of thing to be able to move forward with verification and compliance of any agreement. We saw the stuff that came out of the Israelis were able to get their hands on in 2018, a treasure trove of information. There are currently 4 sites in Iran that the Iranians are not being forthwith about, the IAEA. And it leaves us to draw conclusions about its real intentions, which I unfortunately, once again, I believe are malign. The deal didn't moderate Iran's aggression. One hope was that the nuclear agreement would moderate Iran's conduct by reducing its international isolation. It hasn't. It still supports international terrorism, supports Yemen's Houthi rebels, paramilitary units in Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, and is continuing threat to Middle Eastern maritime and regional security. And I think if you read the worldwide threat assessment that came out yesterday, the unclassified version of the intelligence community, they talk about Iran and its cyber threat, including the 2020 elections in the United States, and probably elsewhere too, but this dealt with the United States. Let us not forget that while the JCPOA remains in effect, even though the United States left, there are still a number of other parties to this, France and the UK and Germany and China and Russia. Iran continues to violate it and has done so and increasingly violates it. Its low enrichment uranium stockpiles are 12 to 14 times what are allowed under the JCPOA. They've increased uranium enrichment. It's limited to 3.67%, which could be used for low enriched uranium for a reactor. And now they're 20%. Now they're talking about going to 60%. They've started deploying advanced uranium enriching centrifuges. They were supposed to be using IR1s, which are basic Iranian centrifuges, but they have 2s, 4s, 5s, and 6s, and they're developing one that's an IR9 that may be 50 times more efficient than the IR1. They're also exceeding the total number of centrifuges allowed at Natanz and as well as Fordo. And they've expanded the locations for uranium enrichment. It was supposed to be at Natanz, and now they're doing it at Fordo, which was only meant for research and development. And then recently, a month or two ago, they were accused of producing uranium metal, which among a limited number of uses can be used in a nuclear weapon core. And of course, all this has potential to reduce the nuclear breakout time. The breakout time is a period that it takes to produce enough fissile material for a bomb starting right now. The JCPOA thought that would be about a year under the restrictions placed upon Iran. Of course, that would expire in 2025, going back to the sunset. Iran has already moved to 20% enrichment, which a lot of physicists will tell you is about 90% of the effort in getting to weapon grade uranium. It's just really, that's the most difficult steps is getting to that 20%, and then it's really much easier after that point. So I got to say that Iran's, and I think others agree that Iran's breakout time has shortened because of all of these violations of the JCPOA. We don't know exactly by how much, but it could be much shorter. And some people are speculating. I mean, some people have speculated, and I think David Albright might be one of them, and said it's down to about 3 months. I won't use. I think that's what David said, but don't quote me on that. Yes, and check David out on his work. But I think that's what they're talking about. And of course, Iran wants us to worry about this as these talks go on. Beyond nuclear issues, the deal does not address ballistic missiles. This is another thing. While exact numbers are difficult to figure out regarding Iran's missile arsenal, the Defense Intelligence Agency tells us it has the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East, and there's no reason to doubt that. They're talking about 50 medium-range ballistic missile launchers and 100 short-range ballistic missile launchers, and those are only launchers. That doesn't include reloads or the missiles. You can have more than one missile per launcher, and some people think that Iran may have several hundred missiles that are available in the short and medium-range capability, and these can go out to 2,000 kilometers from Iran's borders, which would include all of the Middle East, parts of South Asia, and parts of Southeastern Europe, which would include, I believe, some NATO countries. Iran, we're not only talking about ballistic missiles, which obviously are of concern, and when you talk about nukes, but we're also talking about cruise missiles, and if you want to add into that, unmanned combat aerial vehicles or armed drones. These allow Iran to project Iranian power and influence throughout the region, and compensating for Iran's long-standing lack of conventional air power. Indeed, its missile programs arguably come to play a central role in advancing Iran's ambitions in the Middle East. And of course, we can't forget about it. It was mentioned previously by the congressman and Roger, I believe, but we can't remember that we saw 10 Iranian missiles fly into attack the Ain al-Assad base in Iraq, which injured a significant number of US troops posted there just a little over a year ago. Elsewhere, Saudi Arabia has endured nearly 900 ballistic missile and armed drone attacks from the Houthi rebels in Yemen who are being supplied by Iran. They've also seen attacks out of Iraq into Saudi Arabia by Iranian-backed paramilitary units. Unfortunately, the JCPOA, as we all know, didn't capture Iran's development of these missiles or any other types of missiles. Iran's space program is also of tremendous concern. The IRGC has now put a military spy satellite into space, and unfortunately, as rocket scientists know, there isn't much difference between a space launch vehicle for a satellite and a space launch vehicle for an ICBM. So a lot of people are concerned that Iran is actually developing an ICBM program under the guise of a civilian and military program. Another thing gets worse, and I'd really like to hear Bruce say a few things about this, but there was a UN report out in February that Iran and North Korea are cooperating again on long-range missiles. There's always been concern about nuclear cooperation. There's not much in the public sphere about this, and even space. But if these two are cooperating together at some level, it certainly could speed up Iran's program, because North Korea is obviously in a position, as Bruce well knows, to help them if they wish to do so and have the capability to advance Iran's programs. And this outside assistance can make a huge difference in a proliferation problem. In fact, I'm going to quote David. He's not here, but I did see something in the Wall Street Journal the other day from him, which I thought was very interesting, kind of summing it up. He said that Iran could explode, it wasn't a quote, but it was a paraphrase, could explode a test device within 9 months, build a basic nuclear weapon in a year, and affix a warhead to a ballistic missile in 2 years. So that's pretty frightening. In closing, stopping Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, which I believe is Iran's strategic intent, I just can't get away from this, is a clear national security imperative for the United States. So too is preventing Iran from developing the means to deliver these weapons to potential targets in the region or beyond, including the United States. Nor can the U.S. ignore Iran's conventionally armed missiles as a significant threat to America's national interests and those of our U.S. allies and partners in the Middle East. Unfortunately, failing to deal with Iran's nuclear threat, which is we're trying to do in Vienna, hopefully competently and comprehensively through diplomacy, and its growing missile arsenal will only elevate the risk of crisis and conflict in the region. So thank you very much, Betty.
Great, thanks, Pete. That was a very helpful summary of the Iranian threat. So now finally over to Tom.
Well, thank you, Patty Jane. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Turner for his leadership on these issues, and Roger for co-hosting today. Now, we're at a particularly important moment for the question of countering missile threats. And the shift signaled by the National Defense Strategy and the recent service operating concepts, that shift is now going to be put to the test as the Pentagon tries to birth the new joint warfighting concept and make some other tough choices about force structure. And along the way, there's going to be some birthing pangs, getting out and getting accepted, both the joint warfighting concept and the long-awaited masterpiece of budget realignment. Now, the title of this panel presupposes a focus on rogue state ballistic missile threats. The somewhat contrarian question I'll pose today is to what extent it makes sense for U.S. missile defense efforts to remain so relatively focused on that particular category. It's been a long time since the 1990s when rogue state ballistic missiles and WMD were all the rage. Think back to the 98 Rumsfeld report, to the national intelligence estimates when their prediction of a rogue state ICBM by 2015 was only off by a couple years, as it turned out. It's also now been almost 17 years since the initial defensive capability of GMD back in 2004. Over the course of the last 3 administrations, Bush, Obama, and Trump, homeland ballistic missile defense has proceeded on a fairly steady, linear path. The Bush administration chose not to pursue block improvements, instead opting for capacity. The Obama administration originally held off, but soon thereafter moved to field an additional 14 GBIs by 2017. In general, capacity over capability. A capacity boost of 20 GBIs was also the Trump administration's initial inclination. As of last month, we have, for the first time in a long time, pursued a different course, favoring the long-term development of capability over short-term capacity building. Now, that's all been fine and well and necessary in what you might call the post-Cold War period, but we're in a different period now. And although the return of strategic competition with near peers began in earnest maybe 5-8 years ago, it wasn't really announced until that 2018 NDS. And as the NDS said, it's the central challenge of our time. When the 2019 Missile Defense Review was released, it was prefaced with the comment that the degree and urgency of change required to restore missile defense and conventional overmatch must not be underestimated. Notwithstanding that statement, neither the budgets, programs, or policy documents of the past few years have come anywhere close to realizing that degree of change. And despite acknowledging the changed threat environment, the last Missile Defense Review retained a focus on rogue state BMD. As I've said before, the 2019 MDR and the associated budgets were insufficiently aligned with the NDS rather than nested within it. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying what is sometimes said, that the Trump administration's budgets and policy documents fell short of the aspirations expressed by President Trump's own speech about intercepting any missile anytime from anywhere. Those are good words, but perhaps somewhat counterproductive when they're not backed up by budgets and programs. No, I'm pointing to something more fundamental, that the insufficiency and misalignment of our past missile defense efforts have been because of their focus on rogue state ballistic missiles. In short, the Trump administration's missile defense approach did not break China. You may like it or not, but the decisions that were made, the delays that were imposed, and other activities have brought us now to this point where we can no longer continue with business as usual. And the Biden administration now faces a sharp reality: how to really and truly adapt our missile defense and defeat efforts to the central challenge of our time. This realignment will require dramatic change. It may in part require us to accept and manage greater risk from the likes of North Korea and Iran in order to get after other missile problems. Just as Russia and China would be quite happy for us to be bogged down in the Middle East forever, so too, they would probably be happy for U.S. missile defense efforts to remain focused on rogue state ballistics. The 2019 MDR reaffirmed that the United States would continue to rely upon deterrence in terms of major ICBM attack from the likes of Russia and China. I don't see that changing anytime soon. The next generation interceptor is now moving forward, and that's good, but it's going to take time to get there. In the meantime, today's strategic and threat environment calls out for a regional focus. But unlike the regional focus of the past, this one would be against different actors. This means changes to our policy and to programs. It may mean moving air defenses out of the Middle East and to Asia. The next policy review might tackle this by focusing on the broad air and missile defense threat and the relationship between high-end BMD and counter-UAS and air defense. It has to be more comprehensive and integrated, but not just by repeating the word integrated over and over. It means like MDA and service programs need to be thought about together and put together. Things like SHORAD, IBCS, and IFPC, and other elements of cruise missile defense can't be omitted as they were from past reviews. This is not an endorsement of abandoning the Homeland BMD mission, far from it. NGI is underway, and we must continue to prioritize GMD life extension programs and other reliability improvements, as the Senate defense appropriators have signaled in recent years. That must continue. Rather, now that we're on the other side of NGI awards, we had the time to go back and backfill these regional air and missile defense efforts, especially those tailored to the likes of China. So what are the components of such an approach? Permit me to suggest 5. The first is an unabashed focus on regional air and missile defense. Think about the setbacks to Homeland BMD over the last few years as something of a silver lining and an opportunity. While we work to get NGI right, and its research and development is underway, we have an opportunity to go do the regional and thick air and missile defense and defeat activities like we mean it. The second category would be sensors. In testimony for her nomination hearing to be Deputy Secretary, Dr. Kath Hicks highlighted sensors and discrimination as a particular area of emphasis, and that strikes me as exactly right. Of particular importance here are elevated sensors, in particular the space sensor layer, but also fixed wing and lighter than air platforms. In terms of the sensor payload for the hypersonic and ballistic tracking sensor system, HBTSS, it'd be important to keep that in the Missile Defense Agency and also to keep on track for Tranche 0 and Tranche 1 and keep them focused on a regional issue, which is to say Indo-PACOM. Third is really that applying that regional renaissance to certain key assets in the Pacific. Think Guam, the Pacific, the fleet, air bases, and the like. The Army surely needs to do more on air-based defense, and there's some force structure decisions within the Army that might reflect that rebalance. Fourth, let's stop talking about missile defense as the paradigm and reference point for our policy reviews, and instead talk about missile defeat. Fifth and finally, the missile defeat efforts will require substantial long-range fires, hypersonic, but also the garden variety, supersonic, and subsonic, coming from multiple domains. And yes, multi-domain fires include ground-based fires. This is not Desert Storm, and we're not up against Saddam Hussein's Iraq or some other rogue state. Those fires should include the Army and Marines to truly present multiple dilemmas for the high-end adversary. Now, let me just conclude by saying that missile defense has for far too long been a kind of boutique or niche issue. It cannot and must not be so any longer. In this missile-rich threat environment, countering all of these threats has to be part of our overall deterrence and defense goals. And to do so, we must renew our focus on regional air and missile threats from great powers. It's not going to be easy, but you'll only know that we're doing it. That realignment is happening when we begin to be uncomfortable about leaving assets undefended in the Middle East, and to accept and manage the risk of rogue state ICBM attack on the homeland until the next generation interceptor arrives. These steps will be uncomfortable but necessary to align our missile defense and defeat efforts to what is, after all, the central challenge of our time. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to jump right into some questions. We actually have a great audience question for you, Tom, that I'll ask while we still have your thoughts fresh in our minds. So the question is, we've spent a lot of effort trying to assure China and Russia that our regional missile defenses are not aimed at them. They're for North Korea and Iran, we keep telling them. And that's because Russia and China consider US missile defenses to be a major threat to their offensive capabilities. So how do you think Russia and China would react to your proposed policy shift, and how should the US manage any potential complaints?
So in some respects, what I'm suggesting is to make explicit and then put budgets and programs behind what has often been implicit, going back, for instance, to the Obama administration's caveat that our homeland missile defenses were not about Russia and China, but they never said anything about our regional efforts. And so, of course, we've never said that. It's really a function of doing more there and backing it up. So what I would suggest is that we be explicit about that. We suggest and we hope that every single day China wakes up and thinks that it would be a bad day to attack not just the American homeland, but to attack our allies and US forces in the region. We want to preclude the escalation and preclude the big fight. We also need to make sure that there's a mix of offensive fires, more of them in the region, but also those defensive fires, those air defenses, to complicate the surveillance and targeting job of the bad guys and to slow things down.
That makes sense. In our part one of this event series last week, we heard from our panelists a lot on how Russia and China are really advancing their regional nuclear threats. So I think that proposal makes sense. So one more, I'm gonna stick with you, Tom. One more question on kind of this issue area. In your remarks, you made the recommendation that the Biden administration pursue a pivot, this pivot to emphasize regional missile defense. But given the growing threat from North Korea, especially that we heard from Bruce, is that really the wise thing to do?
Look, this is about managing risk. This is about managing risk and dealing with the consequences of past decisions and past actions and past consequences. The choice in the last several years to cancel the redesigned kill vehicle was a choice, and the way in which it was done had a cost, and that cost is measured primarily in time. And that's kind of where we are right now and why we are on the path to a next generation interceptor. So yes, we need to be focused on the rogue states as well, but I would also suggest that we can't keep up the up tempo of balancing our Patriot forces around the Middle East. Thankfully, we've been boosting our partner capacity. Think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, and lots of other folks in the Middle East, in Europe, and elsewhere. That's all for the good. And now, if we're going to be serious about pivoting or focusing on the big threats, then we're going to have to make force structure decisions, and we're going to have to make posture decisions like we mean that. And so is it happy? No. Is it comfortable? No. But I think that if we're going to focus on Russia and especially China, we're going to have to do less of these other things in terms of those decisions.
So I'd like to hear from Bruce on this next. And in particular, Bruce, you recently co-authored a new RAND report on countering the risks of North Korean nuclear weapons. And in it, it is predicted that North Korea could have more than 240 nuclear weapons by 2027, which is pretty astounding to me. So what effect might this have on U.S. interests and regional stability? And I'd also be curious to see if you have any reactions to Tom's proposals.
Well, on the number of nuclear weapons that North Korea has, even within the intelligence community, it's a series of best assessments. Even with access to classified information, you're making a series of educated assessments or guesses, and then at the end coming up with a number. And you're never sure how accurate you are. Now, back in 2017, there were leaked estimates by CIA and DIA of how much weapons or fissile material North Korea may have. So the assessments ran from 30 to 60 nuclear weapons back in 2017. And it may have been a difference between CIA thinking they had 30 weapons and DIA thinking they had fissile material for 60. But that was years ago. And also the leaked estimate was that they could make 8 to 12 weapons worth of fissile material per year. So what we often tend to have is either the government will leak it, or there will be a leak, or an outside think tank will publish a number. And then we just tend to carry that number forward for years until someone updates it. So someone will say, well, yeah, but this think tank said 20. Well, that may have been 10 years ago. So if you think of 30 to 60, add 8 to 12 weapons worth a year, you're already at a pretty scary number, and then you just continue that. We know that there are facilities outside of the Yongbyon facility that are producing uranium for a uranium-based weapon. So the number can be quite high. I think the concern that our allies have is as that number gets bigger and bigger, and as North Korea clearly has the ability to hit the continental US with weapons, including hydrogen bombs, and as these new weapons have multiple warheads, and as they sort of clearly demonstrate a reentry vehicle at some point in the future, the allies worry that we'll cut them loose, that it'll decouple the alliance. And even years ago, when these issues were coming up, I sort of pointed out to our Asian allies that during the Cold War, we were willing to risk an estimated perhaps 100 million casualties in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, in essence, sacrificing New York, Washington, and LA for Bonn, Paris, and London. So we have to ensure our allies that the extended deterrence guarantee is there. And that guarantee is not just the nuclear umbrella that people think of, it's also missile defense, and it's also conventional forces. It's a three-part guarantee. So, that entails ensuring not only the capabilities, but also the assurances to both our allies and to our opponents that we will be there for our allies, that you can't divide us. So part of that, as Tom has pointed out, is the missile defense, so that if we can defend ourselves in the American homeland, then there will be less uncertainty that we will come to our allies' defense if North Korea either does an attack on them with conventional or nuclear weapons, or is just feeling encouraged to do coercive diplomacy.
Gotcha. And to that same,
I was going to ask Bruce, I haven't had a chance to read your report yet, but there's been talk, and we talked about it last week a little bit at the other event, is that China is expected to double its nuclear arsenal in the next decade. Do you have any sense that that could have something to do with North Korea? I mean, in the sense that, does China feel that, if they're at 200 nuclear weapons today and they may have information or intelligence that says that North Korea is going to be moving in the direction of 240, that they also need to, I mean, I think it's multi-causal, but, and, in the United States and other things, but it's just kind of interesting, considering that if that could be a driver of China's changes in China's arsenal as well, besides the United States and great power competition, et cetera.
Right. Well, my portfolio ends on the south side of the Yalu River, so I'll defer on China to our colleague Dean Chang, who is an eminent expert on China. But I think it would be more that Beijing's calculations are driven by its own sense of competition with the U.S., or however you want to define it, really, as opposed to like, well, if North Korea is getting this, I'd better have more than the little guy next to me. But that also brings up another point, is the relationship between China and North Korea. A lot of people tend to think that China is very big and North Korea is very little, and therefore, especially because China is responsible for over 90% of North Korea's foreign trade, that China must control North Korea, must be dictating to North Korea what it's doing, and that's not the case. Even during the heyday of the Cold War, when North Korean relations with China and then Soviet Union were very good, little North Korea was able to play off the two communist superpowers against each other, so that neither had a real influence over North Korea, as counterintuitive as that may seem. So North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are indigenous, and they were instigated by North Korea's distrust of its allies, China and the Soviet Union. So they may get, or we know they get, technology and expertise and assistance from outside, and that's one of the reasons we have sanctions, is to try to curtail or cut that off. But it's not Moscow or Beijing saying, here's a nuclear weapon design, or here's a missile design. It's North Korea has been, producing it themselves. So I think there would be less of a North Korean factor in Chinese strategic thinking than perhaps others might think.
great. So sticking on North Korea, another question for Bruce. The Biden administration has said that its North Korea policy review will be concluded soon. I think you mentioned that in your opening remarks. Do we have a sense of what might be in or out of its likely policy, and how different do you think it will be from previous administrations?
Well, I covered some of it in the opening remarks, but the Biden administration said it's going to be very new or different from every previous administration. And really there's, I think, greater continuity amongst U.S. administrations on North Korean policy than perhaps people depict it as. No administration or president has a monopoly on good or bad ideas when it comes to North Korea. We've tried 8 international agreements on denuclearization. They've all failed. That's not to say we don't try a 9th. But there are only so many tools in the toolbox, and each administration may prioritize or emphasize one over the other, and even that may shift. I mean, the Bush administration started with a very confrontational policy, and then it shifted to fairly conciliatory under the 6-party talk. So administrations may themselves have several policies. We saw that with Trump, where he's bringing us closer to war on the Korean Peninsula in 2017 than we had been since 1994, 1976, and then having the Singapore summit and accepting a joint statement that was weaker than previous agreements. So, I think we'll see, but Biden has not only said he's going to have a bottom-up approach, but he and his officials are continuing to say denuclearization is the end goal. There's a debate amongst Korea watchers now about whether to maintain denuclearization as our goal, and that's the requirement under 11 UN resolutions, or accept arms control, sort of a lower level of, goal. And we're debating it. I think there's some mischaracterizations or misunderstandings, because I think some depict denuclearization as kind of the John Bolton Libya model, where North Korea has to give up everything before the US gives anything. And that's not really the case. It would be incremental. So one debate we're having is, what I would depict as a 100-yard agreement implemented in 5-yard increments, or a series of 5-yard agreements. I'm more in favor of a big comprehensive agreement like we had with the Soviet Union that I participated in, where, especially because we feel the other guys cheated many times, you define the parameters of the field, you define what a football is. I mean, right now we don't even agree on what the Korean Peninsula is or what the word denuclearization means. So you define the terms, you define, a very good verification protocol. You define what everyone's responsibility is, including the United States, and what benefits we would provide. So, I think if you don't know where the goal line is, you're never going to get there. Others will, but you will have to do that in increments. You don't destroy everything overnight, or you don't give all the benefits overnight. Others will say that's not going to work. Let's do a small agreement, and when everyone is comfortable, we can do another one. That's a good debate we can have. But I think the Biden administration is still emphasizing denuclearization. But as I pointed out before, there's still a lot of unknowns. The level of sanctions enforcement, how much pressure they will impose, what benefits they might offer to North Korea. But the problem, not only now, but in previous administrations, is North Korea once again is refusing to talk. They won't even have a diplomat-to-diplomat meeting. And we saw, that was also under the Trump administration after the October 2019 Stockholm meetings, where they said they didn't even want to have any more of these disgusting negotiations at the working level. And then they didn't want to have any more summit meetings. So, to negotiate, you got to, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make them negotiate. You got to get them into the negotiating room to at least start talking about, what do you mean by hostile policy? What do you mean by a security guarantee or a peace agreement, et cetera? In the last meeting, North Korea refused to even identify what they meant by certain terms.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's really useful. So we have about 15 minutes left and a few great audience questions on hold, but I want to make sure we touch on Iran a little bit. So a couple questions for Pete. First is about recent news. Reports are indicating that the Israelis may have been behind an attack on the Natanz fuel enrichment plant. What possible effect will the incident at Natanz have on Iran's nuclear program?
Oh, fun. Thanks for the question on breaking news. Well, it's always a challenge. We're still learning things, right? Was this a cyber attack? Was it an inside job? What is the extent of the damage? How quickly can the Iranians repair what was going on there? U.S.-Israeli cooperation or non-cooperation or coordination or forewarning, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of things that are going on there. I mean, obviously, this is Iran's main uranium enrichment plant, so it's critical. 5,000 of the 6,000 centrifuges that they have spinning are at Natanz. It's been attacked before. Remember, there was a year or so ago, there was an attack against a building that was being used to build centrifuges at Natanz. It's obviously a critical element of the Iranian nuclear program and of great concern to any number of countries, whether you're Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United States. It's a tremendous concern. So we're going to have to see. Some people are wondering if it'll have an effect on what happens. I mean, I haven't seen any news out of Vienna, which they're coming back today. The Iranians haven't said that they're not coming back. I suppose the shadow war between Israel and Iran will continue. I do kind of doubt that the Iranians, if it was the Israelis, and there is some reason to believe that, there's been some leaking in the news, but we don't, the government has not claimed it. We've seen some things when the Israelis are generally very quiet about these things. We've seen some former Israeli intelligence officials making comments about this, which probably is meant to have a psychological effect on Iran. I mean, Iran must be kind of nervous right now about how this happened in a police state like this. How does something like this happen. Remember what happened last fall with their chief Iranian scientist. But I mean, I would think that, you know, that some people were concerned about that it happened when General Austin, or I'm sorry, Secretary of Defense Austin arrived in Israel. The talks were getting started, but you know, these sort of operations usually take a little bit of time to put together. So I'm not sure if that was if those are just coincidences in that respect. But I think it probably pushes back their program. You know, even if they've got emergency power, it may have damaged some of the centrifuges. Remember, you know, Stuxnet was able to damage a lot of the Iranian centrifuges a long time ago in the cyber attack. I would imagine it will affect a breakout time, depending. But once again, I'm just kind of speculating here because there's so much news and information coming in, and it's very difficult to comment on a dynamic situation like that. You know, like I said, we're just gonna have to see how the Iranians react. But as far as I know, they're still coming back to Vienna to talk. Maybe they're coming back to say we're leaving. But what I understand is that will continue. But it certainly will have, I think, if there was physical damage, that it certainly will have an effect on the Iranian nuclear program at this point.
If I could bother you with one more piece of recent news, the latest I hear is that Iran is now going to start enriching its other enrichment plan, I think now up to 60%. How do you think that will impact, or I guess the combination of the damage at Natanz and now this new enrichment level will impact Iran's leverage over the US in these negotiations?
Well, that's what it's all about, right? I mean, this is what it's all, you know, Iran's been playing this game of, you know, nuclear chicken with the United States and trying to increase, they've got their own maximum pressure campaign going on, but it's nuclear as opposed to economic sanctions. You know, they will do that. That will be probably done at Fordo, which has the fewer but more capable centrifuges, and that's where they're doing the 20% enrichment as opposed to Natanz. So they probably can proceed with that. You know, this is one of these sort of things. We'll have to see how quickly Iran moves. Other than talking about it, I mean, 60% enrichment had been broached previously by Khamenei. I mean, he has said this before. I think last winter he talked about this. And that it was a possibility. So the Iranians are doing any number of things to raise the temperature at these negotiations to get concessions from the United States, and they just keep piling them on, which I think, you know, shows their intent and a lack of goodwill on the part of the Iranian negotiating delegation.
So in our remaining 10 minutes, I want to make sure I take a couple of these great audience questions. And to our audience, please continue submitting them if you have any more. So this first question is I believe for Tom. And it's, how do you enhance U.S. homeland ballistic missile defenses that are essential to counter the threat posed by North Korea and eventually Iran without antagonizing Russia?
Well, the good news here is that notwithstanding the press releases from Moscow and Beijing, that, you know, the very small number, 44 some GBIs up in Alaska, very small number we have up there, is not any real threat to the 1,550 plus, you know, accountable warheads under New START. And I'll be honest, I think, frankly, the path that I kind of laid out here in terms of focusing on regional air and missile defense against our near peers, that's the sort of thing that's going to irritate them more. But you can't really say it's about strategic stability, right? They're going to have to come up with new press releases about for instance, why their regional air defenses are okay, but the U.S. and our allies enhancing ours is not. So, you know, just take a couple examples here. In the past couple of years, I guess it was probably more like a decade ago, at one point the Obama administration sent some Patriot missiles to Poland, although they were just a launcher, and I think at one point at least they didn't even have any interceptors aboard. But the Russians nonetheless made a big to-do about it, and they didn't like that for political reasons, but you can imagine military reasons as well. But the centerpiece of what we could and should be doing here that will not make China happy, but not for strategic stability reasons, got to get off that talking point, and that's the robust air and missile defense for places like Guam and the fleet and other bases in Indo-PACOM. Don't take my word for it. Listen to Admiral Davidson, who said this, the commander of Indo-PACOM, who said that 360-degree capability is his top priority for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. That, along with the utility of ground-based fires, you got a Navy guy, Admiral Davidson, who's endorsing ground-based long-range fires for the Army and the Marines. Those are the kinds of things that, yes, they fit under the regional basket, but and they avoid the strategic stability canard that have for far too long burdened the missile defense conversation. We got to get out of those old ruts. We got to get rid of that intellectual baggage. And so, frankly, we have over the next 8-10 years, while the next generation interceptor comes online, which will, after all, be a limited number of more capable and more reliable interceptors, but a limited number, still nowhere close to anything like strategic stability, where we have an opportunity to focus on the regional air and missile things like we mean it, but not just about the Iran and North Koreas, but also about especially the China thing. So different approaches to Guam, distributed elements, distributed operations on Guam for Aegis Ashore and other places, integration of offensive and defensive means to counter these threats. That's the centerpiece. And you can't really say that that's about strategic stability or it would disrupt strategic stability in a bad way anyway.
Great. I think that's really useful and makes a lot of sense. Okay, next audience question is from William King of the Booz Allen Hamilton organization, and it's for Bruce. What are the prospects of U.S.-China cooperation and planning for North Korean denuclearization? Do you think we can succeed without China's cooperation?
Well, some would say that the chances are slim to none, and Slim just rode out of town. Well, we do need to incorporate other nations around North Korea, and I think at some point we do need to multilateralize the engagement with North Korea on the nuclear program. One of the reasons President Bush pushed for six-party talks is because our allies complained that we were, in the words of the South Korean president, negotiating their security over their heads. So we need to have them in the room. On the other hand, people who participated in the six-party talks said the most progress was when the U.S. and North Korea went for a cup of coffee and actually worked things through and brought them back to the group. But what we've seen over the years is China has tended to be more part of the problem than part of the solution. Usually what happens is after North Korea does something very provocative, a nuclear test or an ICBM test, they will allow an incrementally stronger resolution. So it's taken us 11 resolutions to get to where we are now. And then they will usually enforce the sanctions for 3 to 4 months, and then they will quietly turn a blind eye or allow violations to occur in their waters or near their waters or on their soil. And the U.S., through successive administrations, has tended not to go after the violations, including of U.S. law. So, in previous administrations, we imposed $7 to $9 billion in fines on British and French banks for money laundering for Iran. To date, we've imposed $0 in fines on Chinese banks for money laundering for North Korea. In 2017, the U.S. Congress sent a list of 12 Chinese banks, including the 4 largest in the world. They sent the list to the Trump White House saying, we think these banks are committing money laundering crimes in the U.S. financial system on U.S. soil, and we've taken action against none of them. So there are things we can do. And when you go back to the Banco Delta Asia issue in 2005, it not only led a North Korean official to tell a White House official, you finally found a way to hurt us, but it even led the Bank of China to defy the government of China and cut off North Korea from access to Bank of China because they were fearful of being sanctioned themselves. Well, then we undid the Banco Delta Asia issue, and Bank of China went back to engaging with North Korea. So there are things we can do, even if not to influence the Chinese government, to influence the Chinese banks and businesses that are engaging with North Korea in violation of U.S. law and UN resolutions. Now, the sanctions, they're a tool. They're not a silver bullet, just as diplomacy is not a silver bullet. You need all of them along with other tools of national power in a comprehensive strategy. But we can try to reduce the Chinese banks and businesses that are engaging with North Korea as a way of increasing pressure on Pyongyang, even if the Chinese government isn't willing to get on board.
Great. So we are just about out of time at the end of our event here. So unless our panelists have any final comments or last words they want to make, I think we will conclude on that note. So no final comments. On behalf of Heritage and also the Reagan Institute, our partners, I want to say thanks again to our panelists for joining us for this great discussion on these pressing issues. So, and thanks to our audience for joining us in this great event. And now we're adjourned.